Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a land where the rhythm of life followed the quiet certainty of rivers, where mist curled over terraced hills before dawn, and where entire civilizations rose and fell beneath the patient gaze of heaven. Ancient China does not rush. It does not demand attention. Instead, it unfolds slowly, like silk being unrolled, thread by thread, moment by moment, until you find yourself somewhere far away from the present, listening to the soft crackle of a distant fire and the faint echo of footsteps on worn stone paths. The story begins not with an empire, but with a river. Long before emperors claimed divine authority, before walls stretched across mountains, before scholars recorded the weight of history in ink, there was the Yellow River. It moved with a quiet force, sometimes gentle, sometimes destructive, always shaping the lives of those who lived beside it. The people here did not think of themselves as part of something grand. They were farmers, families, builders of small settlements made from earth and wood, waking each day to the same simple tasks: tending crops, repairing tools, watching the sky for signs of change. Morning arrives slowly in this world. A pale light spreads across the land, revealing fields of millet swaying faintly in the breeze. Smoke rises from low houses, carrying the scent of firewood and cooked grain. There is no hurry. Movements are steady, practiced, almost meditative. Hands know their work without needing instruction. Feet follow familiar paths worn into the ground over countless seasons. Time here is not measured in minutes or hours, but in cycles. The rising and setting of the sun, the shifting of seasons, the slow turning of years. People remember floods more than dates. They recall harvests by feeling rather than numbers: good years, difficult years, years when the river stayed calm, and years when it did not. And sometimes, without warning, everything changes. The Yellow River, which nourishes life, can also take it away. Its waters swell dark and heavy, spilling beyond their banks. Villages disappear beneath the flood. Fields are erased as though they never existed. When the waters retreat, they leave behind thick layers of silt-rich soil, but also silence. The land must be rebuilt. Life must begin again. There is no anger in this rebuilding, no dramatic resistance, only acceptance and the quiet decision to continue. From these beginnings, something larger slowly takes shape. Small communities grow into organized settlements. Leaders emerge not through grand declarations, but through necessity. Someone must coordinate the building of irrigation channels. Someone must decide when to plant, when to harvest, how to prepare for the river's moods. These early leaders are not yet emperors. They are guides, chosen for their ability to maintain balance between people and the forces around them. Their authority is practical, grounded in survival. As generations pass, stories begin to form. They are told in low voices at night, beside fires that flicker against the walls. Stories of ancestors who understood the river, who listened to the wind, who could sense changes before they arrived. These stories are not written down, not yet. They live in memory, shaped slightly each time they are told, carried forward like echoes. Gradually, the idea of order becomes more defined. Villages connect with one another. Paths become roads. Trade begins in simple forms, grain exchanged for tools, tools for cloth, cloth for something else again. With trade comes communication, and with communication comes a shared understanding that extends beyond a single settlement. It is here, in this slow expansion, that the foundation of ancient Chinese civilization begins to settle into place. But it does not happen quickly. Years pass, then decades, then centuries. The pace remains unhurried. In one village, a craftsman shapes clay into vessels, turning them carefully in his hands. Each piece is slightly different, yet all follow a quiet pattern. In another, a group of farmers works together to dig a channel, guiding water from the river into their fields. Their movements are synchronized without needing words. Nearby, children watch, learning not through instruction, but through observation. Life continues, and somewhere along the way, the first traces of written symbols begin to appear. They are simple at first, markings etched into bone or carved into stone. They do not yet form a complete system, but they carry meaning. A record of something observed, something remembered, something considered important enough to preserve beyond a single lifetime. This changes everything, though no one realizes it immediately. Because once something is written, it can remain, not perfectly, not unchanged, but present. The act of recording transforms memory into something more stable, more enduring. It allows knowledge to move across time in a different way. A thought no longer needs to rely solely on being spoken, and remembered it can exist outside the mind that created it. Still, the world remains quiet. There are no sudden leaps forward, no sharp turning points, only gradual shifts, like the steady movement of water shaping stone. Night falls again. The same villages grow still under darkness. Fires burn low. The sounds of the day fade into a soft background hum, distant insects, the occasional movement of animals, the quiet breathing of people at rest. Above, the sky stretches wide and uninterrupted. Stars appear, one by one, forming patterns that some begin to recognize. These patterns, too, become part of the story. They are watched, noted, remembered. There is a sense, subtle, almost unspoken, that everything is connected. The river, the land, the sky, the people. Each influences the others in ways that are not always clear, but always present. And so life continues, not as a straight path, but as a cycle. Flood and renewal, growth and rest, memory and forgetting. Over time, these cycles begin to take on deeper meaning. People start to wonder not just how the world works, but why. Why does the river flood? Why do the seasons change? Why do some years bring abundance while others bring hardship? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They linger, quietly shaping thought. They lead to observation, and observation leads to patterns. Patterns lead to understanding, or at least the beginning of it. And from that understanding, something new begins to emerge. Not suddenly, but inevitably. A sense that there might be an order behind everything. A structure that connects all things, even if it cannot be fully seen. This idea does not arrive fully formed. It grows slowly, like everything else in this world, but it will become important. For now, though, the story remains simple. A river flows. Villages rise and fall. People wake, work, eat, rest. And somewhere in the distance, beyond what anyone here can yet imagine, the first true dynasties are beginning to take shape, structures of power and tradition that will define the future in ways these early communities could never fully predict. But that part of the story has not yet reached them. Not yet. For now, they remain where they have always been, close to the earth, close to the river, moving through time at a pace that feels almost still. And as the night deepens and the last fires fade into darkness, the world settles once more into quiet, the kind of quiet that holds everything together without needing to say a word. And in that silence, ancient China continues, slow, steady, and just beginning to become something more. The quiet does not break when morning returns. It simply shifts. A faint gray light spreads across the horizon once again, revealing the same land, the same river, the same slow patterns of life. But something underneath has begun to change, almost too gently to notice. The villages are still there. The fields still stretch outward, and the people continue their routines. Yet the sense of connection between them has deepened in a way that is difficult to see, but easy to feel. Paths that were once used occasionally are now worn more clearly into the earth. Footsteps pass more frequently between settlements. Where there was once distance, there is now familiarity. People begin to recognize not just faces within their own village, but those from neighboring ones. Exchanges become more regular, more expected. A basket of grain is no longer just a necessity. It is part of a rhythm shared between communities. And with this rhythm comes a subtle shift in thinking. The idea of we begins to stretch beyond a single group. It is still fragile, still undefined, but it is there. In one village, a man who has spent years observing the river begins to notice patterns others have overlooked. He watches the way the water darkens before heavy rains, the way the current changes direction in certain seasons. He says little about it, but when he does, people listen. Not because he demands attention, but because his words seem to match what eventually happens. Nearby, an older woman sits outside her home, shaping threads into cloth. Her hands move with quiet precision, weaving fibers together into something stronger than their individual parts. Children gather near her, not because she calls them, but because they are drawn to the steady rhythm of her work. As she weaves, she speaks softly stories again, but slightly different now. These stories begin to carry lessons, not direct instructions, but reflections. Observations about balance, about patience, about the way things must sometimes give in order to endure. The children do not fully understand, but they remember. And memory, in this world, is everything. Further away, along a wider stretch of the river, a larger settlement has begun to form. It is not yet a city, but it is more than a village. Structures stand closer together. There is a sense of organization that goes beyond individual effort. Here, decisions are made with more intention. Groups gather to discuss where to build, how to prepare for the coming seasons, how to respond to the river if it rises again. There is still no single ruler, no grand authority, but leadership is becoming more visible, not through force, but through trust. Those who can see patterns, who can anticipate change, who can maintain stability, they are the ones people begin to follow. Days pass, blending into one another. Work continues, as it always has. Fields are planted with careful attention. Water is guided through channels that grow slightly more complex each year. Tools are improved, not dramatically, but enough to make tasks a little smoother, a little more efficient. Each small improvement builds upon the last, creating progress so gradual it almost feels invisible. But it is there. At night, the sky remains unchanged, yet the way people look at it begins to shift. What were once just scattered points of light are now seen as patterns, constellations that seem to repeat, returning to the same positions after long stretches of time. Some begin to track these movements, not with exact measurements, but with memory. They notice that certain stars appear during particular seasons, that their positions align with changes on the Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada. These observations are quiet, but they matter. They begin to link the sky with the land, the distant with the immediate. And from this connection, the idea of harmony starts to take shape, not as a concept spoken clearly, but as something felt. A sense that everything must remain in balance, that disruption in one place can ripple outward into others. It is not a rigid belief. It is flexible, like water, adapting to what is needed. One evening, after a long day of work, a group gathers near the edge of the settlement. A fire burns low, casting soft light across their faces. There is no urgency in their movements, no sense of time pressing forward. They sit, they rest, they speak in quiet tones. Someone begins to tell a story, not of ancestors this time, but of something larger, a force that exists beyond the river, beyond the land, beyond even the sky. It is described not as a being, but as a presence, something that guides the natural order of things, something that cannot be seen, but can be understood through the patterns it creates. The others listen, not questioning, not fully accepting, simply absorbing. The idea settles among them, joining all the others that have come before. It will not remain unchanged. take on new meanings over time. But for now, it is just another thread in the fabric of their understanding. Seasons shift again. The air cools slightly. The river slows. Harvest time approaches. Fields that were once green begin to fade into gold. The work becomes more focused, more deliberate. There is a quiet urgency now, not panic, but awareness. What is gathered now will sustain them through the colder months. People move together, cutting, collecting, storing. There is cooperation without command. Each person knows their role, not because it has been assigned, but because it has been learned through repetition. And when the work is done, there is a brief moment of stillness. A pause, not long, but enough to feel. Food is prepared, shared among families. There is no celebration in the way it might be imagined in later times. No loud music, no grand displays, but there is satisfaction. A sense of completion, of readiness. Night falls earlier now. The darkness feels deeper, the air heavier. Fires become more important, not just for warmth, but for comfort. People gather closer, speaking less, listening more. The world outside grows quieter, and so do they. Inside one of the larger dwellings, a young boy lies awake, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. He listens to the soft voices of the adults nearby, their words blending into a low murmur. He does not understand everything they say, but he senses the weight behind it. They are speaking about the future, not in clear terms, not with certainty, but with awareness that things are changing, that the way they live now may not remain the same forever, that something larger is forming, even if they cannot yet see its full shape. The boy closes his eyes, letting the sound of their voices fade into the background. Sleep comes slowly, but when it does, it carries him into dreams shaped by everything he has seen: the river, the fields, the sky, the firelight. Dreams that feel both familiar and distant. Outside, the wind moves gently across the land, carrying with it the scent of earth and water. The river continues its steady flow, unchanged by the thoughts of those who live beside it. But change is coming, not suddenly, not violently, but steadily, like everything else, somewhere beyond these settlements, beyond the edges of what these people know. Larger structures are beginning to take form. Groups are organizing in more complex ways. Authority is becoming more defined. Traditions are beginning to solidify into systems that will last far longer than a single lifetime. These early communities are not yet part of that world, but they are moving toward it, step by step, season by season, generation by generation. And as another night settles over the land, as the fires dim and the voices fade, ancient China continues its quiet transformation, still rooted in simplicity, still guided by rhythm and balance, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming something far greater than it once was. The night passes without interruption, and when dawn returns, it does so with the same gentle certainty as before. Yet, beneath that familiarity, the world has shifted just a little further along its quiet path of change. The settlement by the river wakes slowly. A thin mist lingers over the Arabic leaf, Arabic lamb, Arabic hamzatat leaf, Arabic rot, Arabic dada, softening the edges of everything it touches. Shapes emerge gradually, first the outlines of homes, then the figures of people stepping outside, stretching, breathing in the cool air. There is no rush to begin the day, only a steady return to motion. But the settlement is no longer what it once was. Where there were once scattered dwellings, there are now clusters. Where there were loose paths, there are now routes that feel more intentional. Spaces have begun to take on meaning, areas for gathering, for working, for storing. The arrangement is not planned in any formal way, yet it reflects a growing awareness of structure. Near the center, a group has already begun their work. They are shaping the ground, pressing it firm, clearing stones, leveling uneven patches. It is slow labor, repetitive, but purposeful. They are creating a space not for a single family, but for many. No one announces why. No one needs to. Elsewhere, the sound of water moving through channels becomes more noticeable. What were once simple ditches have grown into a more deliberate system. Water is guided with greater care, directed towards specific fields, controlled in ways that reduce waste. It is still imperfect, still vulnerable to the moods of the river, but it shows an understanding that did not exist before. This understanding is spreading, not through instruction, not through written records, but through observation and imitation. One village sees what another has done and adapts it. Improvements move slowly, carried by memory, adjusted through experience. And with each small change, the distance between communities becomes a little smaller, not in space, but in thought. As the sun rises higher, the mist lifts, revealing the full extent of the land. Fields stretch outward in soft patterns, their boundaries more defined than before. Workers move through them in quiet coordination, their movements reflecting a shared rhythm that has taken generations to develop. There is comfort in this repetition, a sense that things are as they should be, but not everything remains steady. By midday, a messenger arrives from a neighboring settlement. He is not announced with ceremony, nor does he carry anything that marks him as important. Yet his presence draws attention. People pause, turning toward him as he approaches the center. He speaks quietly with a small group, those who have become, over time, the ones others listen to. His words are not loud, but they carry weight. Something has happened. Not a disaster, not yet, but a change. The river further upstream has shifted its course slightly. The water has begun to move differently, pressing against banks that have long remained stable. There are signs, subtle but recognizable, that it may not stay contained. The information spreads without urgency, but not without concern. Those who hear it do not react with panic. Instead, they begin to observe more closely. Eyes turn toward the river. Conversations become more focused. The rhythm of the day continues, but with a quiet layer of awareness beneath it. This is how change enters their world, not as a sudden interruption, but as a gradual realization. By evening, the sky has taken on a muted tone. Clouds gather, not heavy, not threatening, but enough to soften the light. The air feels different, carrying a faint sense of pressure that is difficult to define. People notice. They do not speak of it directly, but their movements shift slightly. Tasks are completed with a bit more attention. Tools are set aside more carefully. There is an unspoken agreement to be prepared, even if nothing comes. As darkness falls, the settlement gathers again around small fires. Tonight, the conversations are quieter than usual. Not silent, but more deliberate. The stories told are different too. Instead of distant ancestors or abstract forces, they speak of memory, of past floods, of times when the river rose without warning, of how people responded. There is no exaggeration, no attempt to create fear, only recollection. What was done before? What might be done again? A man with weathered hands traces patterns in the dirt as he speaks, outlining the way water once moved through the land. Others watch, following the lines, imagining the paths. These markings are temporary, but the ideas behind them are not. Nearby, a young girl listens closely, her eyes fixed on the shapes in the ground. She does not fully understand, but she senses their importance. She memorizes what she can, the direction of the lines, the pauses in the man's voice, the way others nod in recognition. This is how knowledge is carried forward, not in perfect form, but in fragments that are pieced together over time. The fire burns lower. The air grows cooler. One by one, people return to their homes, leaving behind only faint traces of warmth in the Arabic halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic hamzatat leaf, Arabic rot, Arabic dada. The night deepens, and somewhere in the darkness, the river continues its slow, unseen movement. It does not rush. It does not announce its intentions, but it is changing. Morning arrives again, and this time, the difference is easier to notice. The river is slightly higher, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to confirm what was suspected. People gather along its edge, standing in quiet observation. There is no shouting, no sudden action, only watching. The surface of the water reflects the pale sky, giving little away. But those who have lived beside it long enough can see the subtle signs, the way the current presses against certain points, the way small debris moves along the edges. They understand, not completely, not with certainty, but enough. By midday, preparations begin, not in a frantic rush, but in steady, coordinated effort. Materials are gathered: earth, wood, stones. Barriers are reinforced where the land dips lower. Channels are adjusted, widened in some places, narrowed in others. Everyone contributes. There is no need to assign roles. Each person moves toward what needs to be done, guided by memory, by observation, by a shared sense of responsibility. The work is quiet, but constant. Hours pass. The sky remains overcast, the light diffused, and then, without warning, the rain begins. It is not heavy at first, just a steady fall, soft but persistent. The Arabic halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic hamzatat leaf, Arabic rot, Arabic dada darkens as it absorbs the water. The river responds slowly, rising almost imperceptibly at first, but it does not stop. As the rain continues, the current strengthens. The surface becomes uneven, shifting in ways that feel less predictable. The sound of water grows louder, filling the space between the settlements with a low, continuous presence. Still, there is no panic, only focus. People move with greater purpose now, reinforcing what they can, guiding water where possible. They do not attempt to control the river completely. That is not something they believe can be done. Instead, they work with it, adjusting, adapting, enduring. Night falls again, but this time it does not bring stillness. The rain continues. The river rises. Fires burn under shelter, their light flickering against wet surfaces. Shadows move in uneven patterns, reflecting the uncertainty of the moment. Inside the dwellings, families remain awake longer than usual. Conversations are minimal, replaced by listening to the rain, to the river, to the subtle changes in sound that might signal something more. The young boy from before lies awake again, his eyes open in the darkness. The familiar sounds of the night have been replaced by something heavier, something that presses against his awareness. He does not feel fear exactly, but he feels the weight of something larger than himself, something that cannot be stopped, only faced. Outside, the river reaches the edge of its banks. Water spills over in thin streams, spreading into the Arabic halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic hamzatat leaf, Arabic rot, Arabic dada beyond. It moves slowly at first, searching for paths, finding the lowest points. The barriers hold for now, but they are tested, and as the hours pass, the water continues to rise. Ancient China does not resist this moment with force. It meets it with patience, with memory, with the quiet understanding that this, too, is part of the cycle. And as the rain falls steadily through the night, as the river presses further into the land, the story moves forward, not toward an end, but toward another beginning shaped by everything that is happening now. The rain does not stop when the next stretch of night gives way to morning. It softens for a while, then returns again, steady and patient, as though it has all the time in the world. The sky remains a muted gray, without sharp edges, without clear direction, and the land beneath it slowly begins to change shape. Water now covers places that only days before had been dry and firm. The edges of the settlement blur, boundaries dissolving into shallow currents that move quietly but persistently. The river has expanded beyond its usual path, no longer confined to the channel people had grown used to watching. Still, there is no chaos. People move carefully through the Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Meme, Arabic Yet, Arabic Alif, Arabic Ha. Their steps deliberate, testing the ground beneath each foot. What was once familiar terrain now requires attention. The Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada feels different, softer, less certain, but it is not entirely unknown. This has happened before, in different ways, at different times. The difference now is not the flood itself, but how the people respond to it. Near the reinforced banks, groups continue their work. The barriers they built during the previous day have slowed the water in some places, redirecting it into areas where it can spread more evenly. It is not a perfect solution, but it is enough to reduce the force, to buy time. Time in moments like this feels both slow and urgent. Each hour stretches, filled with observation and small adjustments. A section of earth gives way slightly, hands move to strengthen it. Water pools too deeply in one area, channels are carved to guide it elsewhere. There is constant movement, but no wasted effort. Children are kept closer to the dwellings now, watched carefully. They do not run freely as they did before. Instead, they sit or stand near the entrances, observing the world as it shifts around them. Some ask quiet questions. Others simply watch, absorbing everything without words. Inside one shelter, an older man sits with several younger members of the settlement. His voice is low, steady, almost blending with the sound of rain against the roof. He speaks of earlier floods, not just the most recent ones, but those from long ago, passed down through memory. He describes how the water once rose higher than expected, how entire fields were lost, how people moved their homes to slightly higher ground in the seasons that followed. He does not speak with fear. He speaks with clarity. The younger listeners lean in slightly, not out of urgency, but out of focus. Each detail matters. Each memory adds to a growing understanding that will guide them, not just now, but in the future. Outside, the rain begins to ease again. The shift is subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. The drops grow lighter. The sound softens. The Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Ha, Arabic Wow, Arabic Alif, Arabic Hamza feels less heavy. The river continues to move, but its rise slows. This change is felt before it is seen. People pause in their work, lifting their heads slightly, listening. There is no announcement, no shared signal, just a quiet recognition that something has shifted. By midday, the rain has reduced to a faint drizzle. The clouds remain, but they feel thinner, less dense. Light begins to filter through in soft patches, touching the water covered with a pale glow. The river has not yet receded, but it has stopped advancing. And that is enough. A different kind of work begins. where before the focus was on holding the water back, now it turns to guiding it away. Channels are reopened, extended, deepened where necessary. Water that has pooled in low areas is slowly redirected, encouraged to return toward the main flow. It is careful work. Rushed movement would only disturb the further, making it more unstable. So everything is done with patience. Hands move through mud and water, shaping, adjusting, smoothing. Tools are used when needed, but much of the work is done directly, with touch and feel guiding each action. Hours pass again, but this time the atmosphere is different. There is still effort, still concentration, but also a quiet sense of relief, not because the situation is over, but because it has reached a turning point. The worst has not come, and perhaps it will not. As evening approaches, the water begins to withdraw slightly from the edges of the settlement. It does not vanish all at once. It lingers, leaving behind a thick layer of dark, wet soil that clings to everything it touched. The look's different now, smoother in some places, uneven in others, but alive. The people notice this too. They have seen it before, the way the river leaves behind fertile ground after it recedes. The same water that threatens their homes also brings renewal. This understanding does not erase the difficulty of the flood, but it balances it. Nothing here is entirely destructive. Nothing is entirely beneficial. Everything exists somewhere in between. Night falls again, but this time it brings a different kind of quiet. The rain has stopped. The river continues its steady movement, but without the urgency of before. The sounds that fill the darkness are softer now, water flowing, settling, the occasional movement of someone still awake. Fires are lit again, though many are smaller than usual. The air is damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and wood. People gather, but the conversations are lighter, not celebratory, not loud, just eased. There is a sense of having passed through something together. Inside one of the larger dwellings, the young boy sits close to the entrance, watching the faint glow of firelight outside. His eyes follow the movement of shadows across the ground, now shaped differently by the uneven surface left behind by the water. He thinks about what he has seen, the rising river, the work of the Manush, Inus around him, the way everything changed, and then began to settle again. He does not fully understand it, but he feels its importance. Somewhere within him, a memory is forming, one that will stay, that will guide him in ways he cannot yet imagine. The older voices around him speak again, but their tone has shifted. Now they talk about what comes next, not in grand plans, but in small considerations, where to rebuild certain structures, which areas of are now better suited for planting, how to adjust the channels so that future floods might be guided more effectively. These are not decisions made quickly. They are discussed, reflected upon, and allowed to settle, because here decisions are not separate from time. They are part of it. Outside, the sky begins to clear. Not completely, but enough for a few stars to appear between the thinning clouds. Their presence feels steady, unchanged by everything that has happened below. People notice them just as they always have, and in that moment, the connection returns the sense that the Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada, the river, and the sky are all part of the same quiet system, balanced, interwoven, enduring. Days will pass, and the water will continue to recede. The will dry, though it will carry the marks of what has happened. New growth will eventually emerge, stronger in the soil left behind. The settlement will adjust. It always does. And with each cycle, something is added, not just to the land, but to the understanding of those who live upon it. This flood will become another story, another memory told beside future fires. It will join all the others, shaping the way people think, the way they prepare, the way they live. Nothing is lost entirely. Everything becomes part of what comes next. And as the night deepens once more, calm and steady, ancient China continues its quiet transformation, no longer untouched by challenge, but strengthened by it, shaped by it, moving forward at the same unhurried pace that has carried it from the very beginning. The ground does not return to what it was, even as the last traces of standing water slowly disappear. The land holds onto the memory of the flood. The soil remains darker, heavier, richer, in a way that is both visible and felt beneath each step. Footprints press deeper now. Movements require a little more care. But there is also a quiet understanding among that this change, like all others, carries something useful within it. Morning settles gently over the settlement once again, this time without mist or rain. The air feels clearer, lighter, as if something has been washed away. The sky stretches wide and pale, uninterrupted, except for a few drifting clouds that move without urgency. People begin to step outside, one by one, taking in what remains. There is no sense of loss spoken aloud. Even though parts of the settlement have shifted, some structures weakened, others needing repair. Instead, there is observation. A slow walk across familiar paths that now feel slightly unfamiliar. A pause here, a glance there. Hands brushing against surfaces, testing stability, measuring change through touch rather than sight alone. Work begins again, but it does not resemble the work of before. This is not the steady repetition of planting or harvesting. This is adjustment. Near the edge of the settlement, a group gathers around a section of land where the water had pooled the deepest. The surface has dried unevenly, leaving behind small ridges and shallow depressions. One person steps forward, pressing their foot into the ground, feeling its resistance. Others follow. There is no discussion at first, only shared observation. Then, gradually, ideas begin to form, not spoken clearly, but expressed through action. One person begins to level a small area. Another clears away debris carried by the water. A third traces a shallow line, suggesting where a channel might be deepened or redirected. These actions spread outward, quiet and coordinated. The settlement begins to reshape itself. Elsewhere, damaged structures are carefully dismantled, not discarded. Wood is set aside, sorted by condition. Pieces that remain strong are kept for rebuilding. Nothing is wasted. Everything is considered. The rhythm of movement returns, but it is different now, more deliberate, more thoughtful. Time passes without being counted. The sun moves steadily across the sky, casting light that reveals the changing texture of the land. Shadows fall differently where the ground has shifted. Familiar spaces feel subtly altered, yet still recognizable. Children move more freely again, though not as carelessly as before. They step around the softer areas, watching where they place their feet. Some of them begin to mimic the work of the adults, pressing the soil, moving small objects, experimenting with the shapes left behind by the flood. They are learning, not through instruction, but through experience. Near the center of the settlement, a larger gathering begins to take shape. People arrive slowly, not summoned, but drawn by a shared sense that something needs to be considered together. They form a loose circle, standing or sitting where they find space. No one takes a central position. No voice rises above the others. Yet there is focus. One of the older members begins to speak. His words are measured, spaced with pauses that allow them to settle. He does not speak of the flood as something unusual, nor as something to be feared. Instead, he speaks of patterns, of how the river behaves over time, of how the land responds, of how small changes in one place can influence what happens elsewhere. As he speaks, others add to his thoughts, not interrupting, not correcting, but expanding. Each contribution builds upon the last, forming a shared understanding that is deeper than any single perspective. They speak of raising certain areas slightly higher, of adjusting the flow of water before it reaches the settlement, of placing structures in ways that align better with the natural movement of the river. These are not commands. They are possibilities. And from these possibilities, decisions begin to emerge, not declared, but accepted through quiet agreement. The gathering disperses slowly. There is no final moment, no clear end. People simply return to their tasks, carrying with them what has been shared. And then the work begins again. Days pass in this way. The settlement evolves, not dramatically, but steadily. Small elevations are built where needed. Channels are refined, shaped with greater awareness of how water moves across the land. Structures are rebuilt with subtle differences, slightly higher foundations, stronger supports, positions chosen with more care. Each change is small, but together they form something significant. The The river continues its flow nearby, now calmer, its surface smooth and reflective once more. It gives no sign of the force it carried only days before. Yet no one forgets. Memory lingers in the land and in the people. One evening, as the sun begins to lower, casting long shadows across the settlement, a quiet stillness settles in again. The air is warm, carrying the faint scent of earth drying under the fading light. A few individuals walk toward the river's edge. They do not go to work or to gather water, but simply to stand. They watch the current move, steady and uninterrupted. The surface reflects the sky, now shifting into soft tones of gold and pale orange. There is no conversation, only observation. In this moment, the river does not feel like something to be controlled or resisted. It feels like something to be understood. Its movement is constant, yet never exactly the same. Its path is shaped by the land, but it also shapes the land in return. This balance becomes clearer with each passing season, and slowly it begins to influence the way people think beyond the river itself. Balance in work, balance in rest, balance in how they build, how they share, how they respond to change. These ideas are not written down. They are not taught directly, but they are present, woven into daily life. As darkness approaches, the group at the river's edge returns to the settlement. Fires are lit once more, their glow steady and familiar. The sounds of the evening return, quiet voices, the soft movement of tools being set aside, the occasional crackle of wood. Inside one dwelling, the young boy sits close to the entrance again, as he often does. But tonight, his gaze is different. He is not just watching. He is thinking. His mind moves through the images he has seen over the past days, the rising water, the careful work, the changes in the land. He tries to understand how it all connects, how one moment leads to another. He does not find clear answers, but he does not need them. The process itself is enough. Nearby, the older voices speak again, though more quietly than before. They do not discuss the flood now, but something broader. They speak of the future, not as a distant idea, but as something shaped by every small action taken in the present. They speak of how each generation carries forward what the previous one has learned, adding to it, adjusting it, passing it on. The boy listens, not fully grasping the meaning, but sensing its importance. Outside, the sky has cleared completely. Stars appear in greater numbers now, bright against the darkening sky. Their patterns feel more defined, more noticeable than before. Some of the older members step outside, looking upward, tracing familiar shapes with their eyes. They do not name them. They do not measure them, but they remember them. And in that memory, another layer of understanding quietly forms. Time continues to move, as it always has, not in sharp leaps, but in steady progression. The settlement settles into its new form. The land begins to stabilize. The river flows on, and somewhere within all of this, something deeper takes root, a way of living that is shaped not by control, but by awareness, not by force, but by adaptation. Ancient China does not rise in a single moment. It grows like this, through small changes, through quiet observations, through the patient accumulation of knowledge and experience. And as another night settles over the land, calm and undisturbed, the story continues, not toward an ending, but forward into something that is slowly, steadily becoming more defined with each passing day. The following morning does not feel like a beginning so much as a continuation of everything that has already been set in motion. The air is cooler now, carrying the faint freshness that comes after long rain and shifting earth. The settlement wakes slowly, not because there is hesitation, but because there is no urgency. The world has changed its pace, and everyone has adjusted without needing to be told. The river, once again, moves within its familiar boundaries. It is not as wild as before, yet it is not entirely subdued either. It flows with a steady presence that commands attention without demanding fear. Along its banks, the shows clear signs of what has passed, layers of sediment, uneven textures, new contours that did not exist before. What was once flat is now gently sculpted, as if the land itself has been rewritten. People begin their routines with quiet familiarity, but each action carries a slight difference. When they step onto the soil, they feel its changed consistency. When they collect water, they notice the clarity returning. When they move through the paths between dwellings, they recognize where the ground has settled and where it still holds moisture beneath the surface. Work resumes not as repetition, but as refinement. Small groups gather near sections of land that were most affected. They study the flow of water, not in abstract terms, but through direct observation. A stick placed in the ground reveals direction. A shallow trench shows how quickly water chooses one path over another. These simple tests become part of their thinking, guiding decisions without needing formal instruction. Gradually, the settlement begins to reorganize itself once more, not in reaction to crisis, but in response to understanding. Homes are repositioned slightly higher where needed. Storage areas are reinforced. Channels are adjusted with more intention than before. Each change is small on its own, but together they reflect a growing awareness that the land is not static, and neither should their approach to it be. There is no single leader directing this transformation. Instead, knowledge moves through observation, through shared experience, through quiet agreement formed over time. Those who notice something first demonstrate it. Others observe, test, and then adopt. In this way, improvement spreads naturally, without resistance. By midday, the settlement feels more stable than it did only a few days earlier. Not because the environment has fully settled, but because the people within it have adapted. And adaptation here is everything. Near the river, a small group stands watching the current again. This has become a habit, almost a ritual, though no one calls it that. They observe how the water bends around certain formations, how it slows in shallow areas, how it deepens in others. They do not simply look, they interpret. One of them kneels, tracing a line in the soil that mirrors the river's curve. Another adjusts it slightly, suggesting a different path. A third watches silently, then adds a second line, indicating where overflow might naturally spread if left unchecked. There is no debate, only layering of understanding. These simple markings begin to represent something larger than themselves. They are not just lines in the earth, they are ideas made visible. Ideas about control, about cooperation, about working with forces rather than against them. As the day progresses, the heat increases slightly, drying the upper layers of soil. That begins to firm again, making movement easier. Children take advantage of this, exploring areas that were previously too soft or unstable. Their play is not separate from observation. It is part of it. They step where others have stepped, repeat gestures they have seen, experiment with the patterns left behind by adults. They are absorbing the world in a way that is unstructured, yet deeply effective. In the center of the settlement, rebuilding continues. Damaged sections are no longer just repaired, they are improved. Walls are reinforced with additional layers. Foundations are raised a little higher than before. Materials are selected not only for availability, but for durability in changing conditions. The memory of the flood remains present in every decision, even if not spoken aloud. It is no longer an event. It is a reference point. As evening approaches, a subtle shift occurs in the atmosphere. The light softens, stretching long shadows across the settlement. The air cools again, carrying a sense of calm that is different from the stillness of before. It is not the calm of uncertainty, but the calm of adjustment completed. People gather in smaller clusters now. Conversations are less about what happened and more about what has been learned. Someone speaks of how water always finds the lowest path. Another mentions how small barriers can redirect larger flows if placed correctly. These are not grand discoveries, but practical insights gained through direct experience. And yet, together, they form a growing body of understanding that will shape how this community lives going forward. As night returns, the fires are steadier than before. They are no longer surrounded by tension or watchfulness, but by routine presence. The crackling of wood, the soft exchange of words, the occasional silence, all of it feels balanced. Inside one of the dwellings, the young boy sits in the same familiar place near the entrance. But tonight, his expression is different. Less uncertain, more reflective. He thinks about the river again, but not as something separate from himself. He thinks about how it changes, how it moves, how it responds to the He thinks about the people who shaped the land beside it and how their actions influenced what happened. He begins to see a pattern, though he cannot yet name it clearly. Outside, the older voices continue their quiet discussion. They speak of continuity, how each generation inherits not just land, but understanding. How what is learned here will not remain confined to this moment, but will be passed forward, adjusted, expanded. There is a sense that nothing is truly isolated. Everything connects. Everything continues. Above them, the sky remains clear. Stars scatter across it in familiar arrangements. Some are brighter than others, some clustered, some distant. Their presence feels constant, unaffected by the changes below. A few individuals step outside again, looking upward as they often do. They do not search for answers in the stars, but for reassurance in their repetition. The sky, unlike the river, does not shift in visible ways. It remains steady, predictable in its cycles, and that steadiness becomes its own kind of reference. The night deepens, the settlement settles, the river continues its quiet movement nearby, now less threatening, more integrated into the awareness of those who live beside it. In the days that follow, this balance will continue to refine itself. Small adjustments will accumulate. Knowledge will deepen. Practices will evolve without disruption. Nothing here changes suddenly. Everything changes gradually. And in that gradual movement lies the foundation of something much larger than any single moment can contain. A way of living shaped by observation. A way of thinking shaped by experience. A way of adapting that does not resist the world, but responds to it. Ancient China, still in its early form, does not announce its direction. It simply continues, quietly, steadily, and always forward. The settlement enters a new phase that feels quieter on the surface, but far more structured underneath. After the flood and the adjustments that followed, something subtle has changed in how people think. It is no longer only about reacting to nature. It is about anticipating it. Morning begins again in the same slow rhythm, but now there is a deeper awareness behind every action. When people step outside, they do not just look at what is in front of them. They observe carefully how the soil holds moisture, how the river behaves at a distance, how the wind moves across open land. These details, once ignored, are now becoming part of daily thinking. Work continues, but it is no longer random effort. It is guided by experience that has been earned through struggle. Near the riverbank, a new kind of structure begins to take shape. It is not a wall meant to stop water completely, because that idea has already been tested and found unrealistic. Instead, it is something more intelligent in design, an arrangement of raised sections and controlled openings that allow water to spread in safer directions when it rises. The people working on it do not call it anything special. To them, it is simply improvement. But in reality, It marks a shift in how they relate to the environment around them. Nothing is seen as fixed anymore. Everything is adjustable. Even the land itself is treated as something that can be shaped over time. As days pass, the settlement becomes more organized without anyone explicitly planning it. Paths become clearer, not because they are drawn, but because they are used repeatedly with intention. Certain areas naturally become spaces for gathering, others for storage, others for work. Function begins to define structure. There is a quiet intelligence emerging from collective experience. People no longer rely only on memory passed through speech. They rely on observation repeated over time. If something works once, it is remembered. If it works twice, it is trusted. If it works many times, it becomes part of routine practice. This is how knowledge slowly stabilizes, not through sudden discovery, but through repetition. The river, meanwhile, remains a constant presence. It is no longer feared in the same way as before, but it is never ignored. Its movement is always being watched, not with anxiety, but with respect. People now understand that it is not an enemy and not a friend. It is simply a force that must be understood. One afternoon, a group gathers again near a stretch of land that had been heavily affected by the flood. The soil here is richer than before, darker, and more fertile. Small signs of new plant growth are already visible. What once was a place of disruption is slowly becoming a place of renewal. This transformation is not lost on those observing it. They begin to connect patterns more clearly now. The same water that caused destruction has also created conditions for stronger growth. The same event that forced change has also improved future stability. This duality becomes an important part of their understanding. Nothing is purely harmful. Nothing is purely beneficial. Everything carries both outcomes depending on how it is approached. As evening approaches, the settlement feels more settled than it has in a long time. Not because nothing is changing, but because change itself has become normal. Firelight spreads across the dwellings again. Conversations return to their usual softness. People speak about the day's work, about small improvements, about observations that might help tomorrow. There is no urgency in their voices anymore, only continuity. Inside one of the larger shelters, a group of older individuals sits together, speaking in calm tones. Their discussion is not about immediate tasks, but about patterns they have noticed over many years. They talk about cycles, how certain seasons bring predictable changes, how the river behaves in repeating ways, how the land responds after periods of stress. These observations are not written anywhere. They exist only in memory and shared conversation, but they are becoming more precise with each generation. A young listener sits nearby, absorbing everything. He does not interrupt. He does not ask questions yet. He simply listens, letting the ideas settle slowly in his mind. Outside, the night sky returns once again in full clarity. Stars are scattered across it, unchanged and distant. Their presence feels steady, almost reassuring. Unlike the river, they do not shift visibly. Unlike the land, they do not change shape. They remain constant, offering a different kind of reference point. Some people step outside to look at them, not for guidance in a literal sense, but for perspective. After days of focusing on the ground, the river, and immediate survival, looking upward creates a sense of balance. It reminds them that their world is part of something much larger. Time continues its slow movement. Days pass, then weeks. The settlement grows more refined in its structure. New adjustments are made to water channels. Higher ground is reinforced. Work areas are optimized based on experience rather than assumption. There is no central authority directing these changes. Instead, improvement spreads through shared understanding. Someone discovers a better way to guide water. Others observe it, test it, and adopt it if it proves useful. In this way, progress becomes collective, not owned, not controlled, shared. The boy from earlier continues to grow within this environment. He watches more than he speaks. He notices how people react to small changes in the land. He sees how decisions form slowly through discussion and observation. Without being told, he begins to understand that knowledge is not something given. It is something built, piece by piece, moment by moment, season by season. One evening, as he sits near the entrance of his dwelling, he watches water being redirected through one of the newly shaped channels. It flows smoothly, exactly as intended, spreading gently into a safer area of land. He does not think of it as engineering or design. He simply sees it as understanding in motion. The world around him feels less chaotic than before, not because it is controlled, but because it is being understood more deeply. And that understanding brings stability, not perfect stability, but enough to continue. Above him, the sky remains unchanged. The stars continue their quiet presence. The river continues its steady movement. The land continues its slow transformation. And within this steady cycle, something larger is forming. Not an empire yet, not a civilization in its final shape, but the foundation of one, built not through sudden power or dramatic change, but through observation, adaptation, and memory carried forward across time. Ancient China, in this moment, is not defined by what it is. It is defined by what it is becoming. And that process continues, quietly, steadily, without pause. The settlement does not feel different the next morning, but something in its behavior has shifted in a way that becomes clearer as the day unfolds. People move with more confidence now, not because the world has become safer, but because they have learned how to respond to it. The uncertainty has not disappeared. It has simply become familiar. The river continues its steady flow, carrying no memory of the struggle that surrounded it days earlier. To it, nothing has changed. But to those who live beside it, everything has changed. The ground has been reshaped, the channels have been adjusted, and the relationship between water and land is no longer one of surprise. It is one of ongoing attention. Morning work begins again, but now there is a subtle difference in how tasks are approached. Before acting, people look around more carefully. They observe how water gathers in small depressions. They notice how soil reacts when stepped on repeatedly. They consider not just what is needed now, but what might happen later if conditions shift again. This way of thinking spreads naturally, without instruction. A group near the central area begins reinforcing a raised section of ground. It is not a large project, and no one announces its importance. But it reflects something deeper, a recognition that elevation provides safety, that preparation is better than reaction. Stones are placed carefully. Soil is compacted layer by layer, and the surface is tested repeatedly until it feels stable. Nearby, another group works on extending a drainage path. It is not an attempt to control the river itself, but to guide excess water away from areas that are more vulnerable. The work is slow, requiring patience, but it is done with certainty. Each movement is informed by what has already been learned through experience. There is no separation between thinking and doing anymore. Observation leads directly to action. As the sun rises higher, the settlement becomes active in multiple directions at once. Work is no longer concentrated in response to crisis, but distributed across ongoing improvement. Repairs continue where needed, but new adjustments are also being made in anticipation of future changes. Children move through these spaces, no longer confined as they were during the flood. They watch closely, imitating small actions, repeating gestures, asking questions that are simple but revealing. Why does the water move that way? Why is this area higher than that one? Why is soil placed here and not there? The answers they receive are not always direct. Sometimes they are shown rather than told, and in that showing, understanding begins to form. By midday, the settlement feels more structured than before, not in appearance alone, but in behavior. Movement between areas follows more defined paths. Work groups form naturally based on familiarity and skill. Decisions about adjustments are made more quickly because people now share a common understanding of what works. This shared understanding is not written anywhere. It exists in memory, in repetition, in practice. Near the river, the water remains calm, but those who observe it closely notice subtle variations in flow. These details are no longer ignored. They are studied. Someone kneels to place a marker in the soil where the current weakens slightly. Another stands a short distance away, watching how debris collects along the edge. A third considers how a slight adjustment in land, height, might change the direction of overflow. These observations are not part of formal instruction. They are part of lived experience, and they are becoming increasingly precise. As the day continues, a sense of continuity settles over the settlement. Nothing dramatic happens. There are no sudden events, no disruptions. Instead, there is steady progress. Adjustments accumulate. Knowledge deepens. Practices improve. Even the sounds of the settlement reflect this change. There is less urgency in voices, fewer abrupt movements. Work tools strike the Arabic alif, Arabic lam, Arabic hamzatat alif, Arabic rat, Arabic dada, with rhythm rather than force. Conversations occur in pauses between tasks rather than interruptions of them. By late afternoon, the heat softens slightly, and shadows lengthen across the ground. The settlement begins to transition into its quieter phase of the day. Tasks slow, not because they are unfinished, but because they are reaching natural pauses. People begin to gather in smaller groups again. Some sit near their dwellings, others near open spaces where air moves more freely. The atmosphere is calm, but not idle. There is still thinking, still reflecting. An older individual begins speaking to a small group nearby. His voice is steady, carrying the weight of long observation rather than authority. He does not give commands or predictions. Instead, he speaks about patterns he has seen over many years. He describes how the river behaves differently depending on the season. He explains how land that appears stable in one cycle may shift in another. He recalls times when early signs were ignored and later became problems, and times when small observations prevented larger difficulties. Those listening do not interrupt. They do not challenge. They absorb. This exchange is not formal teaching. It is shared memory being transferred forward. As evening approaches, the sky begins to shift in color. Warm tones spread slowly across the horizon, reflecting softly on the surface of the river. The settlement grows quieter, but not empty. Activity reduces, but awareness remains. People begin to prepare for night in ways that have become routine. Fires are arranged in familiar places. Supplies are stored more carefully than before. Paths are checked briefly, not out of fear, but out of habit shaped by experience. Inside one dwelling, the young boy sits again near the entrance. He watches the changes in light as the sun lowers. His thoughts move more freely now than before. He no longer focuses only on immediate events. He begins to think about connections, how water, land, and people influence one another. He remembers the flood not as a single event, but as a series of changes that led to other changes. He remembers how the land looked before, during, and after. He begins to understand that nothing remains the same for long. This realization does not feel alarming to him. It feels natural. Outside, stars begin to appear once more. The sky transitions into its familiar night pattern. The settlement settles into rest, but not complete stillness. There is always someone awake, always someone observing, always someone maintaining awareness of the environment. The river continues its movement in the background, steady and unchanging in its motion, though not in its effects. And over time, this continuous presence becomes part of life itself. Days pass in this rhythm. Improvement continues in small, consistent steps. Adjustments to land and water systems become more refined. Knowledge spreads more efficiently through observation and repetition. Mistakes are corrected not through punishment or conflict, but through shared recognition. Gradually, a way of living takes shape that is defined by responsiveness rather than resistance. The settlement no longer sees nature as something to conquer or avoid. It sees it as something to understand and adapt to continuously. This shift does not happen all at once. It emerges slowly, almost invisibly, through countless small decisions made by many people over time. And as this continues, the foundation of something larger begins to form. Not yet a state, not yet a defined system, but a civilization in its earliest, most organic form, built on memory, shaped by experience, sustained by observation, and carried forward by generations who learn not through instruction alone, but through living within the patterns of the world itself. The river flows on. The land changes slowly. The people adapt. The days that follow do not introduce anything new in a dramatic sense, but they deepen everything that has already begun. Life in the settlement settles into a rhythm that feels more stable than before, yet more aware at the same time. There is a quiet understanding that nothing here is permanent, and that awareness itself has become the foundation of how people live. Morning light arrives softly over the river, touching the surface in long, thin reflections that shift with every movement of water. The settlement wakes gradually, as it always does, but now there is a sense of coordination that was not present in earlier times. People begin their work with less hesitation. They already know what to look for when they step outside: the moisture of the soil, the direction of the wind, the behavior of the river. Each of these small details has become meaningful. Work areas are now more clearly defined, not through formal planning, but through repeated use and natural organization. Certain spaces are consistently used for gathering materials, others for repair, others for shaping the land. This structure has emerged slowly over time, shaped by necessity and reinforced by habit. Nothing about it feels forced. It feels discovered. Near the riverbank, the system of channels that was developed after the flood continues to be refined. Water now flows through it more predictably, guided by carefully shaped paths that reduce sudden overflow into vulnerable areas. These channels are not perfect, but they are effective enough to make a difference during changes in water level. People no longer treat this system as temporary. It has become part of the land itself. Adjustments are still made, but they are smaller now. A slight deepening here, a widening there, a reinforcement where erosion begins to appear. Each modification is based on observation rather than assumption. Someone notices a shift, others confirm it, and action follows naturally. There is no separation between noticing and responding. In the center of the settlement, rebuilding continues in a more permanent form than before. Structures are not simply restored to their previous condition. They are improved. Foundations are raised slightly higher than the surrounding Arabic Halif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Talif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada. Materials are selected with greater care. Spaces between buildings are adjusted to allow better movement of both people and water. These choices are not debated extensively. They are accepted because they have been proven useful through experience. Children now grow up in an environment where change is expected, not feared. They see the land shift. They see the river move. They see adults respond calmly and effectively. This shapes their understanding of the world in ways that are subtle but lasting. They begin to learn that stability is not the absence of change, but the ability to respond to it. One afternoon, a small group gathers near a section of elevated ground that was built after the flood. It overlooks part of the river and surrounding fields. From here, the flow of water can be observed more clearly. It is a simple place, but it has become important because it allows people to see patterns they might otherwise miss. They stand quietly, watching. The river moves steadily, but not uniformly. There are variations in speed, small shifts in direction, areas where the current weakens or strengthens. These details are no longer overlooked. They are discussed, compared, remembered. One person gestures toward a section where water slows before turning slightly. Another responds by suggesting that this area might require further adjustment in the channel system. A third considers how seasonal changes might affect this pattern. These are not formal decisions. They are ongoing thoughts shared between individuals who have learned to think together through experience. As the sun moves across the sky, the heat increases slightly, drying the upper layers of soil. The settlement continues its work, but at a slower pace. There is no urgency, only continuation. By late afternoon, a familiar stillness begins to settle. This is not the stillness of inactivity, but the natural pause that comes when daily tasks reach their completion. Tools are set aside. Materials are stored. Paths grow quieter as movement slows. People begin to gather again in informal groups. Conversations are softer now, more reflective. They speak about what has been observed during the day, what changes were noticed in the river, what adjustments might be needed in the coming days. There is a growing habit of thinking ahead, not in distant terms, but in practical ones. What will the river do if rain returns? How will the soil behave after another cycle of drying? Which areas are most stable and which require attention? These questions are not abstract. They are part of daily awareness. Inside one dwelling, a small group listens to an older individual who has spent many years observing the land. His voice is calm, steady, shaped by repetition rather than emphasis. He does not present himself as someone who knows everything. Instead, he speaks as someone who has watched long enough to notice patterns others may overlook. He talks about cycles again, how water rises and falls, how land responds over time, how certain signs appear before changes become visible. He does not claim certainty. He speaks in probabilities, in tendencies, in experience. Those listening do not interrupt. They understand that knowledge here is not delivered in final form. It is accumulated. Outside, the evening light begins to soften. Shadows stretch across the settlement, blending structures, and Arabic Halif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada, into a unified tone. The river reflects this change, its surface shifting from bright reflection to deeper tones of blue and gray. As night approaches, the settlement prepares in its familiar way. Fires are arranged in steady positions. Supplies are checked briefly. Paths are observed one last time before darkness fully settles. There is no sense of danger, only habit formed through past experience. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits quietly near the entrance again. His awareness of the world around him has grown more structured over time. He no longer simply observes events as isolated moments. He begins to see them as connected sequences. He thinks about the river rising, the land changing, the people responding, and the adjustments that followed. He begins to understand that nothing happens alone. Each event leads to another, forming a continuous chain of cause and response. This realization shapes his thinking quietly, without instruction. Outside, stars begin to appear once more. The sky opens into its familiar pattern, unchanged and distant. People glance upward briefly, not in search of answers, but in acknowledgement of something constant beyond their immediate world. The night settles fully. The settlement becomes still, but not silent. There is always movement somewhere, someone checking water flow, someone tending to stored materials, someone simply watching. The river continues its presence nearby, steady and patient, carrying forward the memory of everything that has passed through it. And in this continuity, life continues to evolve, not through sudden transformation, but through gradual refinement. Each generation inherits not only land, but understanding shaped by those who came before. They inherit methods, observations, and the quiet knowledge that survival depends not on control, but on awareness and adaptation. Over time, this understanding becomes deeper, more structured, more reliable. What began as simple response to nature slowly becomes a way of living, a way of thinking, a foundation for something larger that will continue to grow long after these early moments have passed. The night settles more deeply than before, not with heaviness, but with a kind of quiet completeness. The settlement rests, yet it never fully disappears into silence. Even in darkness, life continues in subtle ways, soft movements near the edges of dwellings, faint sounds of water adjusting itself through the channels, the occasional shift of wind moving across the open land. Everything feels stable, but never static. When morning arrives again, it brings with it a sky that is unusually clear. The air feels lighter, almost refreshed, as though the land has finally exhaled after long strain. The river reflects this clarity, its surface calmer, more even, moving with a steady confidence that mirrors the settlement's own gradual transformation. People step outside with familiar routines, but there is a different quality in their movements now. They are no longer simply reacting to the environment. They are engaging with it. Every action carries intention shaped by accumulated experience. Even small tasks, walking across the ground, lifting tools, adjusting materials, are performed with awareness of their broader impact. The settlement, once shaped primarily by necessity, is now being shaped by understanding. Near the riverbank, the system of channels continues to evolve. What began as a response to flooding has slowly become a structured network that guides water with increasing precision. The people working on it no longer think of it as a temporary solution. It has become an essential part of how they relate to the river. This morning, a small group gathers to observe a section where water flow has slightly weakened. The change is subtle, almost unnoticeable at first glance, but they have learned to trust subtlety. One person kneels, pressing fingers into the soil, feeling its saturation. Another watches the movement of floating debris. A third traces a mental map of how water should ideally pass through this area. There is no disagreement, only quiet alignment of thought. A small adjustment is made. The soil is reshaped, not forcefully, but carefully, allowing water to regain its intended direction. Within moments, the flow begins to correct itself. It is not perfect, but it is improved. These small corrections have become routine. Yet each one reinforces a deeper understanding that balance is not maintained once, but continuously. Further inland, the settlement shows signs of more permanent organization. Paths between structures are now clearly established. They are not marked formally, but they are consistently used, creating visible routes that guide movement naturally. Spaces between buildings are maintained with greater attention, allowing for both access and safety in case of future environmental changes. This organization has not been imposed. It has emerged. As the day progresses, activity spreads across different areas. Some individuals focus on strengthening raised ground. Others refine storage spaces to protect supplies from future moisture. Another group examines older structures, identifying weak points that were revealed during previous environmental stress. Every task is connected to past experience. Every improvement is informed by memory. There is no longer a separation between past and present in their thinking. Everything that has happened continues to influence what is being done now. By midday, the heat increases slightly, and the settlement slows its pace. This pause is not enforced. It is natural. Work continues, but at a gentler rhythm. People move into shaded areas, not to stop working entirely, but to reflect, to plan, to observe. It is during these quieter hours that much of the deeper thinking occurs. Near one of the elevated points overlooking the river, a small group gathers again. This place has become a quiet center for observation, though it holds no formal significance. From here, the river's behavior is easier to read. Subtle changes in flow become more visible. The interaction between water and land is clearer from this perspective. They stand for a long time without speaking. The river moves steadily below them. Its surface shifts with light variations, never fully still, never chaotic. One person eventually speaks, pointing out how the water consistently slows at a particular bend. Another responds by suggesting that this pattern might repeat during certain seasonal conditions. A third considers how past adjustments to the channels have influenced this behavior. Their conversation is not structured, but it is precise in its awareness. They are not discovering the river. They are learning to interpret it more accurately. As the afternoon begins to soften, attention turns once again toward the settlement itself. Small repairs are completed. Adjustments are finalized. Materials are organized for future use. There is no sense of urgency, only completion of ongoing refinement. Inside one dwelling, an older individual sits with a few younger members of the community. His voice remains steady, shaped by years of observation rather than authority. He does not speak in absolute terms. Instead, he describes patterns, how certain environmental conditions tend to follow others, how the land responds over time, how repeated experiences form reliable expectations. He emphasizes observation over assumption. Those listening remain quiet, absorbing each detail. They are not being taught in a formal sense. They are inheriting a way of thinking. Outside, the light begins its slow transition toward evening. Shadows lengthen across the settlement, stretching over structures, paths, and open Arabic alif, Arabic lam, Arabic hamzatat alif, Arabic rat, Arabic dada. The river reflects the changing sky, its surface shifting from bright clarity to deeper tones of gold and blue. Work gradually slows again, not because it is complete, but because the natural rhythm of the day is reaching its pause. People begin to gather in smaller groups once more. Conversations are relaxed, but still meaningful. They speak of what they noticed during the day, of minor changes in water flow, of improvements made to structures, of ideas for future adjustments. There is a growing habit of collective reflection. Knowledge is no longer confined to individuals. It circulates. As night approaches, fires are lit in their usual places. The glow spreads across the settlement, creating a soft contrast against the darkening surroundings. The atmosphere is calm, but attentive. There is always awareness present, even in rest. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits quietly, watching the firelight flicker against the entrance. His understanding of the world continues to deepen, not through instruction, but through observation repeated over time. He thinks about the river again, not as a single force, but as something that behaves differently depending on conditions. He thinks about the land, how it changes shape, how it responds. He thinks about the people, how they adapt without needing to be told. A quiet realization continues to form within him that everything is connected through continuous change. Nothing remains fixed. Everything responds. Outside, the sky opens once more into night. Stars appear gradually, forming familiar patterns above. The people of the settlement glance upward briefly, as they often do, not searching for meaning, but acknowledging continuity. The stars remain unchanged. The land does not. The river flows constantly. The people adjust. And within this contrast, understanding continues to grow. The settlement rests, but it is never truly inactive. Even in stillness, it is learning, adapting, preparing. This cycle continues without interruption. Days become weeks. Weeks become longer patterns of adjustment and refinement. The systems they have built become more reliable. The understanding they share becomes more precise. The relationship between land, water, and people becomes increasingly balanced, not through control, but through awareness. What began as survival has become structure. What began as reaction has become understanding. And what began as a simple settlement beside a river has slowly begun to resemble something far more enduring, a foundation shaped not by force, but by observation, memory, and continuous adaptation. The river flows on. The land changes gradually. The people continue to learn. The settlement wakes again under a sky that carries a softer tone than before, as if the world itself has settled into a more stable rhythm. There is no sign of disturbance, no hint of urgency in the air. Instead, there is continuity, the kind that does not announce itself, but reveals itself through repetition. People step outside with the same movements they have grown used to, yet each action is now slightly more deliberate. The habits formed through earlier hardship have not faded. They have been absorbed into daily life. Even simple tasks are carried out with a quiet awareness of their purpose. The river flows steadily beside them, unchanged in its essence, but better understood than before. It is no longer viewed as unpredictable in a chaotic sense. It is viewed as variable within patterns. This shift in perception has changed everything about how the settlement functions. Work begins across the Arabic Halif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada, in multiple directions at once. Some focus on reinforcing raised areas that protect the most important parts of the settlement. Others maintain the channels that guide water during seasonal changes. A few return to older sections of land, reviewing how previous adjustments have held up over time. There is a growing sense that nothing is ever truly finished. Everything is maintained, adjusted, and refined continuously. This idea does not create pressure. It creates awareness. Near the riverbank, small groups gather as they often do. Their purpose is not formal, yet their presence has become essential. They observe how water interacts with the land, how sediment shifts after light changes in flow, how even minor variations in the environment can influence movement. One person kneels near the edge, pressing fingers into the soil. Another watches the surface of the water closely, noting how it curves around submerged shapes. A third traces the outline of a possible adjustment in their mind, imagining how a slight change in elevation might redirect flow during heavier movement. These observations are not recorded in writing. They are shared through conversation, repetition, and demonstration. Knowledge exists in motion here, not in fixed form. As the sun rises higher, activity spreads deeper into the settlement. Repairs that were delayed earlier are now completed. Materials are moved from storage to areas where they are needed. Structures that were weakened in previous cycles are reinforced with improved methods based on experience. The changes are subtle but meaningful. Walls are thicker in certain areas. Foundations are slightly elevated. Spaces between structures are adjusted to allow better movement of both people and water. None of these changes are revolutionary on their own, but together they represent a shift in how the settlement understands permanence. Nothing is permanent, only adaptable. By midday, the heat softens movement, and work slows into a more measured rhythm. People pause in shaded areas, not as a break from activity, but as part of its natural flow. During these quieter moments, thinking becomes more reflective. Discussions arise naturally among small groups. They speak about patterns they have noticed, how certain soil areas retain moisture longer, how wind direction influences drying, how the river's behavior subtly shifts with seasonal transitions. There is no urgency in these conversations. They are part of ongoing observation. Near a slightly elevated point overlooking the river, a familiar group gathers again. This place has become a quiet center of attention without any formal designation. From here, the river reveals its structure more clearly. Movement becomes easier to interpret when viewed from a distance. They stand in silence for a while, watching. The river continues its steady motion, neither aggressive nor passive. It moves with consistency that feels almost intentional, though it is simply natural process. One person eventually speaks, noting how a particular bend consistently slows water before redirecting it toward a wider section. Another responds by connecting this observation to earlier changes made in nearby channels. A third considers how future adjustments might influence this pattern further. Their understanding is not fixed. It evolves with each observation. As afternoon transitions toward evening, the settlement begins to slow once again. Work is not stopped, but it naturally reduces in intensity. Tasks reach logical pauses. Tools are set aside. Materials are organized for the next cycle of activity. This rhythm has become familiar. It no longer feels like effort to maintain. It feels like structure emerging from experience. Inside one of the larger dwellings, a group gathers once more around an older individual whose presence is valued not for authority, but for long observation. His voice remains steady and calm as he speaks about what has been seen over many years. He does not describe events as isolated moments. He describes them as sequences, one change leading to another, one adjustment influencing another outcome, one pattern repeating in slightly different forms over time. He emphasizes that understanding does not come from a single moment of insight, but from continuous attention. Those listening remain quiet, absorbing the depth of accumulated experience. They are not being instructed in a formal sense. They are participating in the transfer of understanding from one generation to another. Outside, the sky begins its slow transformation into evening tones. The light softens across the Arabic alif, Arabic lam, Arabic hamzatat alif, Arabic rat, Arabic dada, casting long shadows that blend structures and land into a unified visual rhythm. The river reflects this change, shifting in color, but not in motion. As night approaches, activity slows further. Fires are prepared in their familiar places. Their glow spreads gently across the settlement, offering warmth and visibility without disrupting the calm atmosphere. People gather in smaller groups, continuing conversations in softer tones. They speak of the day's observations, of minor improvements, of ideas that may be tested in future cycles. There is no finality to these discussions. They are part of ongoing thought. Inside a modest dwelling, the young boy sits again near the entrance, watching the firelight flicker. His understanding of the world continues to grow in layers rather than steps. He no longer sees events as separate. He sees them as connected through time. He remembers the flood not as a single event, but as a series of changes that affected everything afterward. He understands now that the land, the water, and the people are not separate systems, but interdependent ones. This realization does not feel overwhelming. It feels natural, as if it was always present, but only now becoming clear. Outside, the night sky returns in full clarity. Stars appear across it in familiar arrangements, unchanged and distant. People glance upward briefly, not searching for answers, but acknowledging continuity. The contrast between sky and Arabic Halif, Arabic lamb, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada remains constant. One stable, one changing. One distant, one immediate. And between them, life continues. The settlement rests, but it does not become inactive. There is always awareness present, always someone observing, always someone maintaining connection with the environment. The river continues its movement without pause, shaping and being shaped in return. Days pass in steady rhythm. Improvements accumulate gradually. Knowledge becomes more refined through repetition and shared experience. What once was uncertainty has become structured adaptation. What once was reaction has become anticipation. And what once was a simple collection of dwellings beside a river has developed into something more complex, more interconnected, and more enduring. A system of living shaped not by control, but by continuous understanding. The story does not reach a conclusion here. The next cycle of days arrives without any clear distinction from the last. Yet the settlement feels increasingly distinct in its internal rhythm. Nothing dramatic occurs, and yet everything continues to refine itself in small, almost invisible ways. The people no longer wait for change to force their actions. They begin to anticipate it, reading subtle signs in the environment that would have once gone unnoticed. Morning light spreads across the land in familiar softness, but the reaction to it is different now. Before stepping into work, people pause briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of habit shaped by awareness. They look toward the river, toward the ground, toward the sky. These are no longer separate elements in their thinking. They are part of a continuous system that must be understood together. The river remains steady, but its behavior is still studied with care. Even when it appears calm, it is never ignored. The memory of its earlier rise has not faded. Instead, it has become part of how every movement near it is evaluated. Work begins across the settlement with coordinated quietness. There is no central instruction, yet there is alignment. Groups form naturally around areas that require attention. Some focus on maintaining elevated ground. Others inspect drainage channels. A few return to older sections of the settlement to confirm that previous improvements continue to function as intended. This constant checking is not seen as repetition. It is seen as responsibility. Near the riverbank, observation continues as it always does. The same individuals gather, though their composition slowly shifts over time as more people become involved in this process of reading the land. They watch not only the water, but the interaction between water and soil, between movement and resistance. One person notices a slight change in the way sediment is settling along a curve in the river. Another observes how a narrow section is gradually becoming deeper over time due to consistent flow. A third considers how this slow transformation might eventually alter nearby land stability if left unaddressed. These observations are shared without urgency, but they are never ignored. The settlement has developed a quiet discipline of attention. By midday, activity spreads outward again. Repairs continue, but so does refinement. The focus is no longer only on restoring what was damaged in the past. It is now about improving what already exists. This shift is subtle but significant. It reflects a growing confidence in their understanding of how the environment behaves. Structures are adjusted not only for safety, but for efficiency. Paths are slightly redirected to reduce erosion in frequently used areas. Storage spaces are reinforced to better protect resources during seasonal changes. Water channels are extended in ways that allow for more controlled distribution across the land. Every change is small, every change is intentional, and every change is informed by experience. As the sun moves higher, the pace of work slows slightly, not because of fatigue, but because of environmental rhythm. The heat encourages pause, reflection, and observation. People gather in shaded areas, continuing conversations that often blend practical discussion with long-term thinking. They speak about how certain areas of land respond differently after moisture. They note how some soil remains firm, while other sections soften quickly. They discuss how minor shifts in elevation can significantly influence water flow during heavy movement. These are not theoretical discussions. They are grounded in lived experience. Near the elevated observation point overlooking the river, a group gathers again, as they often do. The location has become a natural place for shared analysis, even though it holds no formal designation. From here, the river reveals its structure more clearly than at ground level. They stand quietly at first, allowing the view to settle into their awareness. The river continues its steady course, but today there is a slight variation in its behavior. A section of flow appears marginally faster than usual, suggesting subtle changes upstream that are not immediately visible from here. One individual points this out. Another connects it to recent weather patterns. A third suggests that this may influence sediment movement in downstream sections over time. Their discussion remains calm, but it is increasingly precise. What was once simple observation has become layered interpretation. As the afternoon progresses, the settlement begins to transition into its slower phase once again. Work does not stop, but it becomes more focused on completion rather than expansion. Tasks that were started earlier in the day are brought to a natural conclusion. Materials are organized. Adjustments are finalized. There is a sense of continuity in everything that is done. Inside a central dwelling, a small group gathers around the familiar older figure, whose experience has become a quiet foundation for shared understanding. He does not dominate the conversation. Instead, he allows it to unfold, adding only when necessary to clarify patterns that might otherwise be overlooked. He speaks again about cycles, not as abstract ideas, but as observable sequences. He explains how changes in one season often lead to predictable responses in the next. He describes how repeated environmental stress leads to adaptation in both land and people over time. His tone remains steady, not instructional, but reflective. Those listening absorb his words without interruption. They are not memorizing instructions. They are internalizing patterns of thought. Outside, the light begins to shift again. Shadows stretch longer across the settlement, merging structures, and Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada into softer contrasts. The river reflects this transition, its surface becoming less bright, more muted. As evening approaches, work slows further. Tools are set aside. Materials are stored. People begin to move toward their evening positions, not out of obligation, but as part of established rhythm. The settlement is quieter now, but not inactive. There is always awareness present. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits near the entrance once more. His presence here has become habitual, but his thoughts continue to deepen. He no longer simply observes events. He connects them. He thinks about how the river changes shape over time. He thinks about how the land responds to water. He thinks about how people adjust their behavior based on what they have seen before. He begins to understand that nothing exists in isolation. Everything is part of a continuous system of interaction. This understanding does not come as a sudden realization. It develops slowly, forming in the background of repeated experience. Outside, night begins to settle fully. The sky transitions into deep darkness, revealing the steady presence of stars once again. Their arrangement remains unchanged, offering a sense of continuity that contrasts with the shifting world below. People glance upward briefly, as they always do, not for answers, but for perspective. The stars remain distant, unaffected by the changes of the Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada. The river continues its movement, shaped by those changes. The settlement exists between these two constants and variables, learning how to exist within both stability and change simultaneously. Fires glow softly across the settlement, providing warmth and light. Conversations continue in low tones, focusing on the day's observations and the subtle improvements made. There is no urgency in their speech. There is only reflection. As the night deepens further, silence becomes more prominent, though it is never complete. There is always movement somewhere, always awareness maintained. The river flows on, steady and persistent. The land continues its gradual transformation, shaped by water, time, and human adaptation. And the people continue their quiet process of learning, not through isolated events, but through continuous observation and response. Over time, this cycle becomes more refined. Patterns become clearer. Responses become more efficient. Understanding deepens not through singular breakthroughs, but through accumulated awareness. What began as simple survival has become structured adaptation. What began as reaction has become anticipation. And what began as a settlement beside a river has evolved into a system of living, shaped by observation, memory, and continuous adjustment. The story does not reach completion here. The settlement enters another phase of quiet continuity, where change no longer feels like an interruption, but rather like a natural layer added to everything already in motion. There is no moment when people declare that things are different. Instead, they simply notice that their way of living has become more precise, more coordinated, and more aware of its surroundings than before. Morning arrives with familiar light, but the response to it has deepened over time. People no longer step out only to begin work. They step out to assess. The first moments of the day are spent reading the environment in small but meaningful ways. The soil is checked with brief touches. The air is felt for moisture. The river is observed not just for its movement, but for its tone, its subtle variations in flow that indicate conditions upstream. These habits are no longer taught. They are inherited through repetition. Across the settlement, movement begins in multiple directions. Some groups head toward the river channels to continue maintenance. Others move toward elevated sections that require reinforcement after gradual wear. A few return to older parts of the settlement where previous improvements are being evaluated for long-term stability. Each action is part of an ongoing process rather than a completed task. Nothing here is considered finished anymore. Everything is considered ongoing. At the riverbank, observation continues as it always has, but the understanding among those who gather there has become more refined. They no longer look only at the surface of the water. They look at interaction patterns, how water meets resistance, how it divides around obstacles, how it gathers force in certain sections before spreading outward again. One individual notices that a section of the riverbed has shifted slightly since the previous cycle. Another connects this shift to a minor change in sediment buildup upstream. A third suggests that if left unchecked, this could slowly alter water distribution in nearby channels over time. These discussions are calm, but increasingly analytical. There is a growing sense that the environment is not unpredictable, only complex. By midday, the settlement settles into its slower rhythm. Work continues, but without urgency. The heat encourages pauses, and during these pauses, thinking becomes more reflective. People sit in shaded areas, not idle, but observant. Even rest has become part of awareness. Conversations emerge naturally, often centered around small observations. Someone mentions how a certain patch of soil dries faster than expected. Another notes how wind direction has subtly shifted compared to previous cycles. A third reflects on how minor adjustments to water flow have improved stability in specific areas of the settlement. These are not formal discussions. They are shared understanding in progress. Near the elevated observation point, a familiar group gathers again. The location has become a natural space for collective awareness, though it holds no official importance. From here, the river reveals its structure more clearly, allowing patterns to emerge that are not visible from ground level. They stand quietly for a while, observing without speaking. The river continues its movement, steady and unbroken. But today, there is a subtle variation in how light reflects off its surface, suggesting a slight change in depth across one section. It is not dramatic, but it is noticeable to those who have learned to read such details. One person eventually points this out. Another connects it to recent adjustments made upstream. A third considers how this might influence future flow distribution if seasonal conditions change. Their understanding is not fixed. It is evolving continuously. As afternoon progresses, the settlement begins to shift again into a quieter state. Work transitions from expansion to maintenance. Adjustments are completed. Materials are organized. Observations from earlier in the day are mentally noted for future reference. There is no separation between thinking and doing anymore. They exist together as part of the same process. Inside a central structure, a group gathers around the older observer, whose long experience continues to provide a steady foundation for collective understanding. His voice remains calm and measured, shaped not by authority, but by long familiarity with patterns of change. He speaks again about repetition, not as sameness, but as variation within cycles. He explains how similar conditions can produce different outcomes depending on subtle differences in timing or placement. He emphasizes that understanding comes not from predicting exact events, but from recognizing tendencies. Those listening do not interrupt. They are not being instructed in a strict sense. They are participating in the continuation of accumulated awareness. Outside, the light begins its gradual transition toward evening. Shadows lengthen across the Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada, merging structures, paths, and open spaces into softer tones. The river reflects this change. its surface becoming more subdued as brightness fades. The settlement slows naturally. Tools are set aside. Tasks are brought to completion. Movement becomes less frequent, but not absent. Evening is not a stop. It is a transition. People gather in smaller groups again. Conversations are quieter, more reflective. They speak about what they observed during the day, what changes they noticed, what small adjustments may be needed in future cycles. There is no urgency in these exchanges, only continuity. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits near the entrance once more. His awareness has grown gradually over time, shaped not by instruction, but by constant exposure to change and response. He thinks about the river again, but now his thoughts are more structured. He no longer sees it as a single entity. He sees it as a system of movement influenced by land, weather, and time. He thinks about how people adjust their actions in response to these changes, and how those actions then influence the environment again. He begins to understand the continuous loop of interaction. This realization does not feel sudden. It feels like something slowly becoming visible after being hidden in plain sight. Outside, night arrives fully. The sky opens into deep darkness, filled with the steady presence of stars. Their positions remain unchanged, offering a sense of continuity that contrasts with the dynamic world below. People glance upward briefly, as they always do, not for guidance, but for orientation within a larger context. The stars remain distant and constant. The river remains close and changing. The settlement exists between these two conditions, learning how to exist within both stability and variation. Fires glow softly across the settlement, casting warm light over familiar spaces. Conversations continue at low volume, blending into the background of night. There is no conclusion to the day, only a quiet continuation into rest. Even in stillness, there is awareness. The river flows on without interruption. The land continues its slow transformation, shaped by both natural processes and human adaptation. And the people continue their gradual learning, building understanding not through isolated events, but through continuous observation, reflection, and adjustment. Over time, this way of living becomes more refined. Patterns become clearer. Responses become more coordinated. Knowledge becomes shared rather than individual. What once was survival becomes structure. What once was reaction becomes anticipation. And what once was a simple settlement beside a river continues its slow evolution into something far more complex, an interconnected system of living shaped by observation, memory, and the continuous recognition that nothing remains the same. Yet everything remains connected. The story does not end here. The settlement does not awaken to anything new. Yet the feeling of the morning carries a subtle difference that only long familiarity can detect. The air is slightly drier, the ground a little firmer, and the river appears calmer at first glance. Nothing announces change directly, but everything suggests it in quiet ways. People step outside as they always do, but their attention is sharper now, almost instinctive. The first moments of the day are no longer passive. They are evaluative. A brief look at the river tells them more than words ever could. A touch of the soil reveals how it will behave under pressure. A glance at the sky hints at what the day might bring. These small readings have become second nature. Across the settlement, activity begins in a familiar pattern, but the purpose behind it has deepened. Maintenance continues along the river channels, where water is carefully guided through paths shaped by previous experience. These channels are no longer experimental. They are refined through repetition, adjusted only when necessary, and trusted because they have proven reliable over time. Near the edges of the settlement, raised sections of land are checked for stability. These areas, once created in response to flooding, are now part of a long-term structure of safety and adaptation. People walk across them slowly, testing firmness, looking for signs of erosion or weakness. When something is found, it is corrected immediately, not with urgency, but with quiet efficiency. The relationship between land and water is no longer something they react to. It is something they continuously manage through understanding. At the riverbank, observation remains a constant practice. A small group gathers again, though their presence is no longer limited to the same individuals. More people have begun joining over time, as awareness spreads that understanding the river is essential to understanding everything else. They watch the movement of water with patient attention. One person notes how the current shifts slightly near a bend, suggesting a gradual change in underlying structure. Another observes how sediment is redistributing in a way that may eventually alter flow patterns. A third considers how recent adjustments upstream are influencing behavior downstream in subtle but measurable ways. These insights are shared without urgency. They are added to a growing collective awareness. By midday, the settlement enters its slower rhythm once again. The heat reduces movement, but not awareness. People rest in shaded areas, yet even rest carries observation. Conversations continue quietly, often focused on small environmental details that might otherwise go unnoticed. Someone mentions how a certain patch of ground retains moisture longer than expected. Another points out that wind direction has been slightly more consistent over recent cycles. These details are not isolated observations. They are part of a larger pattern being gradually understood. Near the elevated observation point, the familiar group gathers again. From here, the river is seen not just as a moving body of water, but as a system of continuous interaction. Its flow reveals structure when viewed with enough attention over time. They stand quietly for a while, allowing the scene to settle into their awareness. The river moves steadily, but there is a slight variation in brightness across its surface, suggesting subtle differences in depth and speed. One individual notices this first. Another connects it to previous changes in channel alignment. A third considers how this might influence future sediment movement if seasonal conditions shift again. Their discussion is calm, but increasingly precise. What was once simple observation has become layered interpretation. As afternoon transitions toward evening, the settlement begins its gradual slowdown. Work shifts from expansion to refinement. Tasks are completed rather than begun. Adjustments are finalized rather than proposed. Materials are organized with attention to future use rather than immediate need. This shift is not directed. It is natural, shaped by environmental rhythm and accumulated habit. Inside a central structure, the older observer once again speaks to a small group gathered around him. His presence is not formal authority, but long familiarity with patterns that others are still learning to recognize. He speaks about change not as disruption, but as continuity. He explains how small variations in conditions often lead to larger outcomes over time, even when those variations seem insignificant at first. He emphasizes that understanding does not come from predicting exact events, but from recognizing recurring relationships between elements. Those listening remain quiet, absorbing his words without interruption. They are not memorizing instructions. They are internalizing ways of thinking. Outside, the light begins to shift again. The sky transitions slowly into evening tones, and shadows stretch across the settlement, blending structures and Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rat, Arabic Dada into softer forms. The river reflects this change, its surface becoming less reflective, more subdued. Activity decreases naturally. Tools are set aside. Movement slows. The settlement enters its evening rhythm. People gather in smaller groups, continuing conversations in low voices. They discuss what was observed during the day, what small changes were noticed, what adjustments might be necessary in the future. These discussions are not formal or structured. They are part of ongoing awareness. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits near the entrance once more. His thoughts are no longer fragmented. They have begun to form connections across time and experience. He reflects on the river, not as a single force, but as a system shaped by countless small influences. He thinks about how land responds to water, how people respond to land, and how each action influences the next in a continuous loop. This understanding does not arrive suddenly. It emerges gradually, shaped by repeated observation and quiet reflection. Outside, night settles fully over the settlement. The sky opens into darkness, filled with steady stars. Their arrangement remains unchanged. offering a sense of continuity that contrasts with the shifting world below. People glance upward briefly, as they often do, not searching for answers, but acknowledging a larger context beyond immediate experience. The stars remain distant and constant. The river remains close and changing. The settlement exists between these two conditions, learning how to live within both stability and transformation. Fires glow softly across the settlement, casting warm light over familiar spaces. Conversations continue at low volume, blending into the background of night. There is no conclusion to the day, only continuation into rest. Even in stillness, awareness remains. The river flows on without interruption. The land continues its gradual transformation, shaped by both natural processes and human adaptation, and the people continue their slow development of understanding, building knowledge not through isolated events, but through continuous observation, reflection, and adjustment across time. Over generations, this way of living becomes more refined. Patterns become clearer. Responses become more coordinated. Knowledge becomes shared, strengthened by repetition and collective memory. What once was survival becomes structure. What once was reaction becomes anticipation. And what once was a small settlement beside a river continues its quiet evolution into a complex system of living, shaped by awareness, adaptation, and the recognition that everything is connected through continuous change. The story does not reach completion here. The settlement continues to evolve in a way that feels less like change and more like deepening. Nothing arrives suddenly anymore. Everything develops through gradual accumulation, as if each day adds a thin layer of understanding over what came before. The people no longer wait for disruption to learn. They learn continuously through attention. Morning arrives again with familiar clarity. The river reflects the pale sky in long, steady lines, its movement unchanged in essence, but better understood with every passing cycle. The ground near its banks has become more stable in some areas and more carefully managed in others. What was once unpredictable terrain has now been shaped into a responsive system. People step outside with practiced awareness. Before beginning their tasks, they observe, not out of caution, but out of habit shaped by experience. The river is checked first, then the soil, then the wind. Each element is read like part of a continuous message that never fully stops. Work begins across the settlement in quiet coordination. There is no central direction, yet there is alignment. Groups naturally form based on need and familiarity. Some continue reinforcing raised areas that protect key sections of the settlement. Others maintain and refine the channels that guide water flow. A few return to older structures, ensuring that previous improvements still function as intended. Nothing is ever considered permanent. Everything is maintained as part of an ongoing process. At the riverbank, observation remains constant. The group that gathers there has grown over time, not by instruction, but by shared understanding that attention to the river is essential to survival and stability. They watch its movement with quiet focus, interpreting small changes that would have once gone unnoticed. One individual notices a slight shift in the way water curves near a familiar bend. Another connects this to recent adjustments in upstream channels. A third considers how seasonal variations may amplify or reduce this effect over time. These observations are not treated as isolated insights. They are added to a collective understanding that continues to expand. By midday, the settlement settles into its slower rhythm. The heat softens movement, but not awareness. People rest in shaded areas, yet even in rest, they remain observant. The environment is never ignored. It is continuously read, even in stillness. Conversations during this time are quiet and reflective. Someone notes how certain soil areas retain moisture longer than others. Another observes how wind patterns have become slightly more consistent over recent cycles. A third reflects on how minor changes in land elevation have affected water distribution during small fluctuations in flow. These are not formal discussions. They are part of ongoing interpretation of the world. Near the elevated observation point, the familiar group gathers once again. From here, the river reveals its structure more clearly than from ground level. Patterns in movement become easier to recognize when viewed with distance and patience. They stand without speaking for a time, simply observing. The river continues its steady flow. There are subtle variations in speed and brightness, suggesting differences in depth and underlying structure. One individual eventually points out a slight widening of flow in a particular section. Another connects this to sediment redistribution observed in earlier cycles. A third considers how this might influence future adjustments to nearby channels. Their understanding is not fixed. It is constantly evolving. As afternoon begins to shift toward evening, the settlement transitions into its quieter phase. Work becomes more focused on completion rather than expansion. Tasks are brought to a close. Materials are organized with care. Adjustments are finalized rather than initiated. This rhythm has become natural, not imposed. Inside a central structure, the older observer continues to speak with a small group gathered around him. His voice remains steady, shaped by long experience rather than authority. He does not provide instructions. He offers perspective shaped by time and observation. He speaks about how patterns repeat across different scales of time. He explains how small changes can influence larger systems when repeated consistently. He emphasizes that understanding comes not from controlling outcomes, but from recognizing relationships between elements within the environment. Those listening remain quiet, absorbing not just his words, but the way he thinks about the world. Outside, the sky begins its gradual transition toward evening. Light softens across the Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Hamzatat Alif, Arabic Rot, Arabic Dada, and shadows lengthen across the settlement. Structures, paths, and open spaces merge into a unified visual tone under the fatting sun. The river reflects this change, its surface becoming less bright, more subdued. Activity slows naturally. Tools are set aside. Movement becomes less frequent, though awareness remains constant. Evening does not end activity. It simply changes its form. People gather in smaller groups again. Conversations are calm and continuous. They speak about what they observed during the day, what small changes were noticed, and what adjustments might be considered in future cycles. These discussions are not structured. They are part of ongoing awareness that extends across time. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits near the entrance, watching the transition from light to darkness. His understanding of the world continues to deepen in ways that are not sudden, but gradual and layered. He thinks about the river not as a single force, but as a system influenced by many small interactions. He thinks about the land, how it responds to water. He thinks about the people, how they adjust their actions based on observation, and how those actions influence the environment in return. He begins to see that everything exists in connection. This realization does not feel like a discovery. It feels like recognition of something that was always present. Outside, night settles fully. The sky opens into deep darkness filled with steady stars. Their arrangement remains unchanged, offering a sense of continuity that contrasts with the shifting world below. People glance upward briefly, as they always do, not for answers, but for perspective. The stars remain constant, distant, and unaffected by change. The river remains close, dynamic, and responsive. The settlement exists between these two conditions, learning how to navigate both stability and transformation. Fires glow across the settlement, casting soft light over familiar spaces. Conversations continue in low tones, blending into the background of night. There is no conclusion to the day, only continuation into rest. Even in stillness, awareness remains present. The river flows on without interruption. The land continues its gradual transformation through natural processes and human adaptation, and the people continue their slow development of understanding, building knowledge not through isolated events, but through continuous observation, reflection, and adjustment across time. Over generations, this way of living becomes increasingly refined. Patterns become clearer. Responses become more coordinated. Knowledge becomes shared and strengthened through repetition and collective memory. What once was survival becomes structure. What once was reaction becomes anticipation. And what once was a simple settlement beside a river, continues its quiet evolution into a complex system of living shaped by awareness, adaptation, and the recognition that everything is connected through continuous change. The story does not conclude here. The settlement moves into another stretch of time where nothing appears to disrupt its rhythm. Yet, everything continues to subtly evolve beneath that surface calm. Days no longer feel like separate units divided by events. They feel like extensions of one continuous process, where each moment carries forward the adjustments of the previous one. Morning arrives with a familiar softness, light spreading evenly across the land without urgency. The river reflects this light in long, shifting patterns that are now well understood by those who live beside it. There is no longer surprise in its movement, but there is constant attention. The river is never ignored, even when it appears calm. People step out into the day with a kind of practiced awareness that has become second nature. The first actions are no longer mechanical routines, but quiet assessments. The soil is checked for firmness. The air is felt for moisture. The direction of wind is noted without conscious effort. These small observations form the foundation of everything that follows. Across the settlement, movement begins in coordinated silence. Groups separate naturally into areas of responsibility, each focused on maintaining the systems that have gradually formed over time. The raised ground is inspected again for signs of wear. The channels guiding water flow are checked for small deviations. Older structures are reviewed not for damage alone, but for how well they continue to function within the evolving landscape. Nothing is treated as permanent. Everything is part of an ongoing cycle of maintenance and adjustment. Near the riverbank, observation continues as it always has, but with deeper familiarity. The group that gathers there has expanded slightly over time as more individuals begin to understand the importance of reading the river continuously rather than reactively. They stand in quiet focus, studying movement that would have once gone unnoticed. One person observes a slight change in the angle of flow near a familiar bend. Another notes how sediment is accumulating more heavily along one edge compared to previous cycles. A third considers how upstream adjustments may be influencing this redistribution in subtle ways. There is no urgency in their discussion. These observations are part of a larger understanding that is built gradually, not in moments, but in accumulation. By midday, the settlement slows into its familiar rhythm of rest and reflection. Heat reduces physical movement, but awareness remains active. Even when people are still, their attention does not fully rest. The environment continues to be observed continuously, as if thinking itself has become inseparable from living. Small groups gather in shaded areas, speaking quietly. Their conversations revolve around patterns rather than isolated events. Someone mentions how certain areas of land now retain moisture more evenly than before. Another points out that wind direction has stabilized slightly over recent cycles. A third reflects on how minor structural adjustments have improved water distribution during recent fluctuations. These are not discoveries in the traditional sense. They are refinements of understanding. Near the elevated observation point, the familiar group gathers again. From this position, the river reveals more than it does at ground level. Its structure becomes visible in layers, variations in speed, depth, and direction that only sustained attention can reveal. They stand without speaking for time, allowing the view to settle into their awareness. The river moves steadily, but not uniformly. There are subtle differences in brightness across its surface, suggesting changes in depth and flow. One individual eventually notes a slight widening in a downstream section. Another connects this to earlier shifts in sediment movement observed over previous cycles. A third considers how continued patterns of flow might gradually reshape nearby land over time. Their understanding remains fluid, shaped by ongoing observation rather than fixed conclusions. As afternoon transitions toward evening, the settlement begins its gradual shift into quieter activity. Work is no longer about expansion, but about completion. Tasks are brought to conclusion rather than initiation. Materials are organized for future use rather than immediate application. Adjustments are finalized with attention to long-term stability. This rhythm has become natural, almost instinctive. Inside a central structure, the older observer continues speaking with a small group gathered around him. His voice remains calm, steady, shaped by long familiarity with the patterns of change that others are still learning to recognize fully. He speaks about continuity within variation, explaining how systems that appear stable are always in motion at smaller scales. He describes how understanding emerges not from isolated events, but from observing relationships across time. He emphasizes that knowledge is not something acquired once, but something maintained continuously through attention. Those listening remain silent, absorbing not just his words, but the way he frames experience itself as a continuous process, rather than a series of separate moments. Outside, the light begins to shift once again. The sky transitions into evening tones, and shadows stretch across the settlement, merging structures, paths, and open land into softer forms. The river reflects this change, its surface becoming less bright and more subdued. Activity slows naturally. Tools are set aside. Movement becomes less frequent, though awareness never fully fades. Evening is not an end. It is a transition into a different state of continuity. People gather in smaller groups, continuing conversations in low tones. They speak about observations made during the day, about subtle environmental changes, about adjustments that may be needed in future cycles. These discussions are not formal or structured. They are part of a shared way of thinking that has developed over time. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits near the entrance again. His awareness has grown gradually through repetition rather than instruction. He no longer sees the world as separate parts. He sees it as interconnected systems influencing one another continuously. He thinks about the river not as a singular force, but as a dynamic system shaped by land, weather, and time. He thinks about the land, how it responds to water. He thinks about people, how they adjust based on observation, and how those adjustments influence the environment again. A quiet understanding forms within him, not sudden, but steady. Outside, night settles fully. The sky opens into deep darkness, filled with stars that remain unchanged across time. Their presence offers a sense of continuity that contrasts with the shifting world below. People glance upward briefly, not in search of meaning, but in recognition of scale. The stars remain distant and constant. The river remains close and changing. The settlement exists between these two realities, learning how to navigate both stability and transformation. Fires glow across the settlement, casting warm light over familiar spaces. Conversations continue softly, blending into the background of night. There is no sense of completion, only continuation into rest. Even in stillness, awareness remains active. The river flows on without interruption. The land continues its gradual transformation through natural processes and human influence, and the people continue their slow, continuous development of understanding, building knowledge not through isolated moments, but through persistent observation, reflection, and adaptation across time. Over generations, this way of living becomes increasingly refined. Patterns become clearer. Responses become more coordinated. Knowledge becomes shared and strengthened through repetition and collective memory. What once was survival becomes structure. What once was reaction becomes anticipation. And what once was a simple settlement beside a river continues its quiet evolution into a complex, interconnected system of living, shaped by awareness, adaptation, and the recognition that everything exists in continuous relationship with everything else. The story does not reach an end here. The settlement enters another long stretch of continuity, where time feels less like a sequence of days and more like a single ongoing process that slowly refines itself. Nothing arrives to disrupt the rhythm, yet everything continues to change in subtle layers that only become visible when observed over long periods. The people no longer measure their progress by individual events, but by the gradual stability of patterns that once felt uncertain. Morning light spreads across the land in its familiar, unhurried way, touching the river first before moving across the settlement. The water reflects the sky with a calm consistency, but those who watch it closely still notice the small variations that reveal its deeper behavior. The river is never truly still, and it is never truly the same, even when it appears unchanged. People step out into the morning with a sense of settled awareness. Their movements are no longer driven by urgency or reaction. Instead, they begin the day by observing the ground beneath their feet, the direction of the wind, the subtle sound of water moving through channels. All of it is read quietly, almost instinctively, as part of a continuous process of understanding the environment they depend on. Across the settlement, activity begins in coordinated silence. There is no need for instruction or direction. Each group knows its role through repetition and shared memory. Some move toward the river channels to maintain the flow of water. Others inspect raised sections of land, ensuring they remain stable after repeated exposure to changing conditions. A few return to older areas, not because something has failed, but because everything must be checked continuously to remain reliable. Nothing is considered complete. Everything is considered ongoing. At the riverbank, observation continues in its quiet, steady form. The group that gathers there has become an integral part of the settlement's way of understanding the world. They no longer simply watch the river. They interpret it. They read its movement as a system of relationships between water, land, and time. One individual notices that the river has slightly deepened along a familiar curve, suggesting gradual erosion beneath the surface. Another observes that sediment accumulation has shifted downstream in a pattern that was not present in earlier cycles. A third connects these changes to recent adjustments made in the water channels, recognizing how small interventions can influence larger systems over time. These insights are not treated as separate discoveries. They are part of a continuous understanding that grows slowly through shared attention. By midday, the settlement settles into its slower rhythm. The heat reduces physical activity, but not awareness. Even in rest, the environment is still being observed. People sit in shaded areas, not disengaged, but reflective. The world around them continues to be part of their attention, even when their bodies are still. Conversations during this time are quiet and thoughtful. Someone remarks on how certain sections of soil now retain moisture more evenly than in earlier cycles. Another notes that wind patterns have become less erratic, following a more predictable direction over time. A third reflects on how small structural adjustments made earlier continue to influence water flow in subtle but meaningful ways. These discussions are not formal. They are part of a shared way of interpreting change as it unfolds. Near the elevated observation point, the familiar group gathers once again. From this height, the river reveals a structure that is not visible at ground level. Its movement is layered, with variations in speed and depth that shift gradually across its width. They stand in silence for a while, allowing the view to settle into their awareness. river continues its steady flow. But today, there is a faint asymmetry in its movement. One side appears slightly faster, suggesting a gradual redistribution of force within the channel. One individual points this out. Another connects it to upstream conditions that may have altered sediment flow. A third considers how this pattern might evolve if left unchanged over future cycles. Their understanding is not fixed. It is always in motion, shaped by continuous observation. As afternoon begins to transition into evening, the settlement slowly shifts its focus. Work moves from expansion to maintenance. Tasks are completed rather than initiated. Materials are organized and stored for future use. Adjustments are made with care, not urgency. This rhythm has become deeply embedded in their way of living. It is not imposed, it is recognized. Inside a central structure, the older observer continues speaking to a small group gathered around him. His presence remains steady, not authoritative, but deeply rooted in long observation of change over time. He speaks about how systems maintain balance, not through resistance to change, but through adaptation to it. He explains how stability is not a fixed state, but a continuous adjustment between forces that are always in motion. He emphasizes that understanding emerges not from controlling outcomes, but from recognizing patterns across time. Those listening remain silent, absorbing his words as part of a broader way of thinking that extends beyond instruction. Outside, the sky begins its gradual shift into evening. Light softens across the land, and shadows lengthen across the settlement. Structures, paths, and open spaces blend into a unified tone under the fading sun. The river reflects this transition, its surface becoming less bright, more subdued. Activity slows naturally. Tools are set aside. Movement becomes less frequent, though awareness never fully fades. Evening is not an end, but a transition into another phase of continuity. People gather in smaller groups, speaking quietly about the day's observations. They discuss subtle changes in the environment, adjustments in water flow, and the long-term effects of gradual modifications. These conversations are not structured or directed. They are part of a shared process of understanding that continues without interruption. Inside one of the smaller dwellings, the young boy sits near the entrance once more. His awareness has developed slowly, shaped not by instruction, but by repeated exposure to patterns of change. He no longer sees the world as separate elements. He sees it as a network of interactions that influence one another continuously. He thinks about the river not as a single force, but as a system shaped by land, weather, and time. He thinks about the ground, how it responds to water. He thinks about the people, how their actions influence the environment, and how the environment in turn shapes their actions. A quiet clarity forms within his understanding, not sudden, but continuous. Outside, night settles fully over the settlement. The sky opens into deep darkness, filled with stars that remain unchanged across time. Their presence offers a sense of continuity that contrasts with the shifting world below. People glance upward briefly, not for answers, but for orientation within a larger context. The stars remain distant and constant. The river remains close and changing. The settlement exists between these two conditions, learning how to navigate both stability and transformation simultaneously. Fires glow softly across the settlement, casting warm light over familiar spaces. Conversations continue in low tones, blending into the quiet atmosphere of night. There is no sense of finality, only continuation into rest. Even in stillness, awareness remains present. The river flows on without interruption. The land continues its slow transformation through natural processes and human influence, and the people continue their gradual refinement of understanding, building knowledge not through isolated moments, but through continuous observation, reflection, and adaptation across time. Over generations, this way of living becomes increasingly structured without becoming rigid. Patterns become clearer. Responses become more coordinated. Knowledge becomes shared and strengthened through repetition and collective memory. What once was survival becomes structure. What once was reaction becomes anticipation. And what once was a simple settlement beside a river continues its quiet evolution into a complex system of living, shaped by awareness, adaptation, and the recognition that everything exists in continuous relationship with everything else. And here the story rests, not as an ending, but as a pause within an ongoing world that continues far beyond this moment.